Hi there and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Capellos in Ottawa on this Monday. Tonight, Trump gunning for Greenland.
The president is looking at Greenland as a strategic asset for the United States. We are not going to outsource our hemispheric security to anyone else.
European leaders attempt a show of sovereign force against U.S. interests in Greenland. As Prime Minister Mark Carney arrives in Davos, Switzerland, Trump will be there too. We've got a top panel with military, political, and diplomatic experience on what the U.S. president's obsession with Arctic defense could mean for Canada's northern shores. Then, is the bromance over?
I found out about this deal, and the auto companies found out, by the way, a few hours before it was announced. So much for the partnership.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford dismayed after Prime Minister Carney inks a deal to let 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the country in exchange for agricultural tariff relief. Premier Ford's D.C. representative David Patterson will be here on that coming up. Plus, we've got our front bench to break down the politics of both of those stories. Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie are all standing by. They're going to be here a little bit later on in the show. First, though, Prime Minister Mark Carney there touching down in Zurich, Switzerland, on his way to the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he's set to continue pitching more Canadian trade to global markets. But overshadowing the big business summit, Donald Trump zeroing in on Greenland, arguing only America can defend the Arctic nation. And in text messages to Norway's Prime Minister, Trump intimated his Nobel Peace Prize snub is part of what's driving that focus on Greenland.
I don't know anything about the president's letter to Norway, and I think it's a complete canard that the president will be doing this because of the Nobel Prize. The president is looking at Greenland as a strategic asset for the United States. We are not going to outsource our hemispheric security to anyone else.
Last one.
I think it would be very unwise.
Threats there being rejected both by Canada and European allies. Take a listen.
It's a serious situation, and we're concerned. We're concerned about this escalation. The future of Greenland, decisions about the future of Greenland, are for Greenland and Denmark to decide. And the security of Greenland, security is first and foremost for them, but very much falls within the responsibilities of NATO.
Any decision about the future status of Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark alone. That right is fundamental, and we support it.
And back in this country, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre posting to social media, it is unacceptable for the U.S. to seize the territory of a sovereign country, including by threatening tariffs on other NATO countries. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and we support its territorial integrity. The statement goes on to say Conservatives support NATO and Canada's obligations as a NATO member. Canada should strengthen the NATO alliance and rebuild our own forces in the Arctic to combat threats also coming from China and Russia and to protect our seas, skies, and soil. This weekend, Donald Trump, as you heard Mr. Poilievre reference there, did announce 8 European countries who have come out against American control of Greenland will face a new 10% tariff as of February. The countries facing Trump's new tariffs all sent handfuls of soldiers to Greenland as part of NATO military exercises. A senior federal government source here says the Prime Minister is weighing a similar decision on the part of Canada for a very small contingent of soldiers to join a future exercise as soon as later this week. Here to unpack all of that, and there is a lot to unpack, former top soldier chief of the Defense Staff, retired General Tom Lawson, former Conservative Defense Minister Peter MacKay, and former Canadian Ambassador to NATO, Carrie Buck. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for making time for the conversation tonight. Mr. MacKay, I wanted to start with you. What does it say in principle that one NATO ally is talking about another in the way we are hearing President Trump reference Greenland?
Well, it's quite shocking, to say the least, and appears to signal that the president is wildly off in all directions when it comes to Greenland. The discussion around either buying or in some way annexing and even using military force is so completely counter to everything that the NATO alliance represents, not to mention, Vashi, the impact that it would have on NORAD from a Canadian perspective because of this close alliance that we have with Denmark, with all of the NATO allies. And, you know, from a political standout, the fallout that could occur in terms of more tariffs, and we're suffering tariffs now, as you know, but also being added to the list of 8 who have spoken out, and Canada participating in some sort of a military exercise would no doubt lead to further repercussions from the Trump administration.
I know it's hard to project or try to predict what's going to happen next, Ms. Beck, but in this moment, a lot has been said, right? Like I pointed out to Mr. McKay, between one NATO ally to another in the form of Denmark and in the United States, not to mention all the countries that Mr. McKay just referenced now are facing new threats of tariffs. What do you think it's, as someone who represented Canada to the alliance, what do you think it's doing to it?
Well, it could kill the alliance if Trump were to make good on his threats to seek to annex Greenland, including by using military force. Even now, there's damage being done to the alliance because it's shaken the notion that the U.S. would weigh in to protect all NATO allies. Instead, it's seeking, for the first time in American history since before the Second World War, it's actually threatening to attack a NATO ally. China, but more importantly, Russia, must be just delighting in this rift within NATO that President Trump has created for reasons that escape me, to be honest. There's no imminent threat on Greenland. There certainly is a need to bolster Greenland's defense in anticipation of potential Russian military action sometime down the road, but not imminent. But NATO's been doing that since I was at NATO 2015 to 2018. They've been doing more, exercising more. NATO allies have been exercising more in Greenland precisely to deter a Russian threat.
General Lawson, I think, you know, certainly we've heard, like we heard from that clip in Mr. Besant, you know, was referencing sort of the feeling from the White House that this is a strategic asset. But there have also been points at which President Trump has not ruled out, you know, not just economic force or tariffs, but actual military force. And that happened as recently as today when NBC News, in a phone call interview, asked him about using force. His only response to that was no comment. What do you take from that?
Well, I think it is unlikely that the president will actually land troops in an aggressive fashion in Greenland, but I don't think it matters too much. I think there's such damage being done to the point that both the minister and Kerry Buck just made. I think it's drawn a huge focus off of where that focus should be. As Kerry Buck said, the Russians will be celebrating right now because space is being given for them to prosecute their illegal and horrific war against Ukraine at a very time that you know, NATO, including the U.S., should be laser focused on what's happening there. That's an existential threat that could come to bear on NATO. You know, this thing that was kind of wistful of several months ago is now turning into a focus of NATO. And if you're into conspiracy theories, which I'm not, you might suggest that that's the whole point of what Trump is doing here.
Mr. McKay, I was listening to your comments to my colleague Michael Couture in our national newscast, and you were sort of talking about, like, what role can Canada play? Is there something that can be done to bring the temperature down on this? And you had reflected that, and please do correct me if my interpretation is wrong, but that there could be a role for Canada here in trying to do just that. And I had met with a bunch of diplomats today, all of European allies who were here in Canada, but saying, you know, particularly with Davos coming up, the president's there, the prime minister's there may be a way for Canada to make a case for increased resources up there that helps dial down the temperature. What kind of possibility exists in that space from where you sit?
Well, I want to be optimistic but realistic, Vashi, and I think that given the opportunity for a face-to-face meeting by the Prime Minister with President Trump at Davos, this, as you said in your lead-in, will sort of overtake other important discussions. And just picking up on General Lawson's point, not only Russia but China are looking at this situation with glee and saying, you know, from a Putin perspective, well, how is this any different than what we are doing in Ukraine? For China, it's Taiwan and others of their neighbors in the Asia Pacific. But to your question, for the Prime Minister to say, look, President, we're willing to do more in the Arctic, and we have signaled that already, and Kerry's right, all NATO countries, Arctic countries, including now Sweden and Finland, are putting their attention to this, including this proposed Arctic maneuvers. Now, Canada does that religiously every year, the Op Nanook. But to speak to that, to the President, let's turn this from a U.S. going it alone, with the unthinkable scenario of being up against other NATO countries, and say, let's lock arms and actually do some significant NATO exercises in the Arctic, in and around Greenland, in and around other parts of the Arctic, other Arctic nations participating. Let's turn the tables, if you will, on Donald Trump's sole fixation on American expansionism and say, if you are truly concerned about Russia and China, let's come up with a plan to do so in unison with Arctic nation countries, with NATO countries, or more specifically through NORAD. And the institutional connective tissue is already there, not to mention the fact that the Americans have a base in Thule, northern Greenland, or now Pifnik, I believe it's known as.
Ms. Buck, what are your thoughts on, not just that possibility, but sort of what's unfolding right now, which is, handfuls of soldiers taking part in these exercises from European countries, Trump threatening tariffs on those countries, Canada mulling, sending, a small number as well. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you have to put those exercises in context. So the exercises of this past weekend, really small numbers. They were a follow-on to a much bigger exercise that happened last September involving the same European allies, 550 troops, air-to-air refuelers, frigates, etc. And Canada also participated last January in some exercises in Greenland. So what's happening this weekend was pre-planned. It was part of a glide path, a continuous round of joint military exercises in Greenland to send that message to Russia, as I said earlier. So President Trump has taken it as a signal to the U.S., and so maybe fortuitously or unfortuitously, it is a signal to the U.S. to change his risk calculus. But the thing right now is to lower the temperature. These exercises are normal. They're not a threat to the U.S., and anything you want to do in the Arctic, we also want to do in the Arctic. And none of us can do it alone, including the U.S., as the minister said, shoulder to shoulder, locked arms, the Arctic 7 will work together to deter Russia, China, and other threats, including economic threats. So I think there's a really compelling argument, but it's not just about President Trump. There's an interesting maneuver in the Senate. A bipartisan bill's been introduced to stop President Trump from attacking a NATO ally through either military threats of annexation or other forms of coercion. The bill's just been launched. We'll see how it goes. But there are a lot of people in the U.S. who think that this really is running against U.S. interests, and diplomacy has to also use those levers as well.
Last word to you, General Lawson, your assessment of those military exercises and sort of all of the, I guess, what you think the speculation about additional representation there from a military perspective is really all about.
Well, I think there's something very important happening there. And although I agree with the minister that it would be ideal if one-on-one our prime minister could help the president recognize that ratcheting down would be good, I think that assumes that this president is rational. If you take the military point of view regarding bullies, or even go back to your schoolyard experiences, when a bully approaches you, it's best to circle yourself with friends. And I think that's what's happening right here. What's happening in Greenland, although they're trying to be as unthreatening as they can to the United States, is they're grouping together and saying something. One-on-one with Mr. Trump, it's never a fair fight. Here you've got 10 of the most important NATO allies, perhaps Canada coming on board, saying, no, don't take this step, and it's important. You're speaking to 10 of us now, and more perhaps in the future. So we'll see what effect that may have.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. I really appreciate all of you making time for the analysis tonight. Peter MacKay, Tom Lawson, and Kerry Buck, thank you so much. We also want to share some new comments from Denmark's foreign minister on the escalating threats from President Trump after he met with top officials at the White House last week. Have a listen.
The meeting we had last week left me with the clear impression that the president honestly and full-heartedly want to acquire Greenland. But we also made it crystal clear that this is a red line. I mean, having said that, we agree to disagree. It is not easy when we wake up every morning to new threats. Please convey that message to the president. And therefore, for a second, I thought, we have managed not to solve the problem, but to find a pathway forward. It was disrupted by the statement from the president, and that's a reality of life.
And we're going to dig into the politics of the Prime Minister's Greenland posture, his trip as well to Davos, Switzerland, with our front bench a little bit later on. Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Enzi will all be here together. First, though, Ontario on the outs. Doug Ford's D.C. trade rep will come on our program in just a moment on why his premier is musing about an end to a partnership with Prime Minister Carney after the federal government inked a trade deal allowing Chinese electric vehicles into Canada. That conversation in just 2 minutes right here on Power Play.
The partnership is communicating with myself or other premiers if it affects their economy, and I feel it's just a terrible deal. It's a terrible deal for the auto workers. Don't use Ontario and the auto workers here as a pond. Everyone got something except Ontario. The Prime Minister knows my number, and I thought we had a good enough relationship that he'd give me a quick text or a little bit of communication. That never happened. That's fine. Like I said, I know where I stand with him.
A dismayed Doug Ford after Prime Minister Mark Carney left China with a new trade agreement. Canada will allow into the country 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles at a reduced tariff rate of 6.1%. That's down from the current 100% tariff, in exchange for China slashing tariffs on several agricultural products, chiefly canola, from 85% to about 15%.
49,000 vehicles is the cap of this agreement. That's the same amount of vehicles that Canada was importing from China in 2023. Okay, so the same level. Although at that time there wasn't a cap. Now there's a cap. But remember, this is a market that is the auto sector, which is evolving very rapidly. And we want to be competitive in this market. We don't want to be competitive in the market of 2010. We want to be competitive in the market in the future. Is what's going to get great jobs for Ontarians going forward.
While the Prime Minister stands by the deal, Ontario is crying foul as that province fights to insulate its auto sector from Donald Trump's tariff trade war. David Patterson is Ontario's representative to Washington, D.C. Hi, Mr. Patterson. Pleasure to welcome you back to the program. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thanks, Vashi.
I want to try and parse apart, if we could, starting with your own experience talking to people there on the ground, what reaction you're getting to the agreement with China, because we've seen, a more muted one from the president, but less muted from a lot of his delegates. So where does the reaction you're getting fit in there?
Yeah, I think we're going to need a little bit more time to see things play through. We clearly saw some sort of concern expressed from Jameson Greer and from the Transport Secretary Duffy and others. We'll see. Of course, the United States is also trying to manage its relationship and its trade agreements with China. So who knows exactly where all those things stand with the president, but there are an awful lot of people in the United States where national security and China are the end and the beginning of every conversation. And so this has got a lot of people's attention here, and we're going to have to be very careful in terms of managing through, I think.
Has there been a lot of outreach directly to you in light of the announcement?
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've, and it crosses parties, and it's a really a common denominator here in the United States of anything to do with China and national security. There's a select committee on China, et cetera. And so I'd say the best thing to describe it is to say there are a lot of questions that we need to get at to understand where this is going and what it means.
You mentioned yourself that the president himself has sort of, I guess, a kind way to put it would be a nuanced position on China. My understanding is he's heading there for a trip himself in April. Do you think that will buttress potentially any of the maybe blowback?
I don't know. I mean, what I do know is working with the auto sector here in the United States, there's a lot of concern as well. And I think getting into sort of the issues or the questions that are there, Chinese electric vehicles are obviously subsidized. They're built with $5 an hour labor. They come in at a much lower cost artificially. So for the entire industry across North America, it is kind of a longer term threat. And I think you have to understand that there is the broader auto market, and then there is the more narrow electric vehicle market, which is more focused right now. And so the number of vehicles that we're talking coming into Canada is actually about 30% or more of the Canadian electric vehicle market. So there's a lot of concern from the industry that we're giving a big head start through this in that particular future-oriented part of the market. And so we hear that in the United States as well.
Sorry, my apologies. I wanted to just follow up and ask, because I know the Prime Minister was on the receiving end of those kinds of questions as well. And his response was basically that this was equivalent to the level of cars coming from China back in 2023, and that it adds a cap where there wasn't a cap back then. Is that information providing any assurance to the voices that you're reflecting tonight are concerned, particularly in the U.S. auto sector?
I mean, what I'm hearing from the auto sector, both in Canada and the United States, is that it's not so much of a cap as something that is planned to grow over a period of time from 50,000 to 70,000 vehicles over a period of time. And while it's true that that's only 3% of the Canadian auto market overall, that's also 30% of the new car, the electric vehicle market, which is where people need to compete to build the future, and where Canada, frankly, has invested billions in battery plants and in electric car supports to be part of that going forward. So it's a question of, what are we trying to do here in terms of being able to support the jobs that we want to see in the future in these areas. The other area, too, is we don't know. We've heard from the Prime Minister that there may be additional investments coming from China as well. Well, we have a Canada Investment Review Act, which we need to think about. We also need to think about the connectivity of these vehicles to our mobile networks, which is something that's very concerning from a national security point of view. In the United States and in Canada as well. So these are questions that we need to work out together, figure out where we're going on these things. But I think the biggest one is we don't want to see anything that is going to be a real problem in making sure we land the plane of renewing the USMCA agreement. And so we need to be communicating a lot more on this thing.
Yeah, let me ask you about your communication, because I'm sure you'll be aware that the Premier at the political level today was voicing some concern about a lack of communication from the Prime Minister directly to him, or a lack of conversation that's happening at the political level. Is there a difference at the apolitical level, the diplomatic level? Are you engaged, for example, with your federal counterpart on this issue?
No, it was a surprise, and look, we also have canola in Ontario. We care very much about working together across Canada. We care very much about diversifying trade and developing all those things. But given that the auto sector is our largest or second largest sector in Canada, with a whole bunch of jobs, and an important one that's going through technology transition, there are legitimate questions. It may not have been possible to consult before, but it would have been nice.
Does this issue, does your gut tell you whether or not this issue makes its way through what we were speaking about last time, this sort of unfolding of the USMCA review process?
I think it can. I think what it means is let's work together to figure out how this will be implemented. There are many, many questions to figure out in terms of, who gets the quotas, what companies come in, what dealerships would support this, can they drive across borders, national security issues in terms of can they connect to mobile networks. These are all things that will have to be discussed further, and we're getting those questions here from the United States as well. So there's a lot of work to be done.
More broadly, just before I let you go, Mr. Patterson, look, before this job, you had a long history in the auto sector itself. I think there are, based on even my inbox alone, a lot of people who work in that sector who have watched what's unfolded over the last year in conjunction with the news over the past few days and really wondered about where the sector is heading, what the future of it is. Are you worried about the future of the sector right now based on everything that's unfolded?
Well, I think we're going through a massive period of change. What gives me comfort is to hear the CEOs at General Motors and Ford saying, no, we really need to stand behind the USMCA. We need Canada. We need Mexico. We've seen that in all the submissions to Jameson Greer. But, it's sometimes hard to read the president's intentions. We're in a particularly volatile time on that, so we need to communicate. And this is an issue that would be good to get ahead of.
Okay, I will leave it on that note. Mr. Patterson, a pleasure as always. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Vashi.
It's Ontario's trade rep in Washington, David Patterson. You heard him talking about the province and the Premier more specifically raising some alarm bells. But will the Prime Minister's deal with China prove to be a political liability? Could the agricultural wins be enough to garner public support? We're going to talk about the politics of all of that next with our front bench, Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. There they are. They're back in just a few minutes. Stay right there.
This is an opportunity for Ontario. It's an opportunity for Ontario workers. Remember, this is a market that is the auto sector, which is evolving very rapidly. And we want to be competitive in this market.
I always say collaboration, cooperation, partnership. It was anything but a partnership. I found out about this deal, and the auto companies found out, by the way, a few hours before it was announced. So much for the partnership.
The agriculture industry, the canola industry, the oilseed industry, the pulse industry is important to virtually each and every part of this country, up to and including Ontario.
In signing a deal with China, Prime Minister Mark Carney handed a win to prairie premiers whose provinces were greatly impacted by the economic hurt of massive Chinese agricultural tariffs. But his bargaining chip, 49,000 low-cost Chinese electric vehicles entering our market, has angered the Premier of Canada's most populous province, with Ontario's Doug Ford suggesting it's the end of their partnership. Here to dig into that political divide is our front bench. With me tonight, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's now the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt. She's the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. Benzie, I have to start with you because I was preparing for the segment tonight reading your piece in the Star, which uses this line to describe it. Employing the lingo of a jilted romantic partner, the Premier sniffled. Well, at least I know where I stand now. Is this romance over, or is it just a bend in the relationship, Benzie?
I think it's just a bend in the relationship, but there is today's vibe at Queen's Park with the Premier was a little like a Taylor Swift song. I mean, it was like, does like Mark Carney have Doug Ford's cardigan or something still? I don't know. There was a weird kind of a little bit of, it was wounded feelings. But I think that it is too important, the relationship is too important politically to both men for this to be a blow up, It's not like they are never ever going to get back together, because I think they will. But I think Mr. Carney didn't do a great job communicating, even though everyone and his aunt and uncle knew that when Scott Moe and him were going to China at the same time, canola was going to happen, and there was going to have to be a concession on Canada's part, and this 100% tariff on Chinese EVs was going to have to be lifted. And now it'll be 6.1% for 49,000 EVs, which, by the way, Vashi, is the same amount of Chinese EVs that came into Canada in 2023. So it's not like this is going to flood the market the way that Mr. Ford is saying, but his hurt feelings are not, they're understandable.
Was it surprising at all to you, Lisa, that there wasn't more effort made to communicate this in advance? Like, there was effort made to communicate it to the United States in order to mitigate major blowout there, but not to Doug Ford, which is kind of surprising, just given how long it's been since, we've had Doug Ford more consistently on the side of a Liberal Prime Minister than we have Scott Moe, for example, who is totally supportive of Prime Minister Carney right now.
Well, I'm going to pick up where Benzie left off and say maybe the parties are going to have to shake it off, just like Taylor Swift used to say as well. Oh, no. Sorry, we'll have to keep going on the line.
Hip,
You're up next, Galant. The reality is this is part of the reason why I don't miss politics, because it's messy. It's really messy. And as a prime minister, you have to make trade-offs. I would assume, Vashi, quite frankly, that he didn't want to give the drop to the premier because he didn't quite know whether or not he was going to have an announcement to make. It's really tough to do these things at the last minute. You don't quite know what's happening. There's a time zone difference. Who knows how quickly this all came together, quite frankly. But they do have to work together. I feel for the premier. He lost his bestie in Chrystia Freeland, and now he's gotten this from Mr. Carney, and it's not pleasant, and it does set the table for some difficult times for Ontario. There's no question about it. But, you want the top job to be prime minister. Tough decisions are going to have to be made. They're not always linear. Politics are involved. It is messy, and we'll see what ends up happening on the vote side.
From a more crass, if I could make it, political viewpoint, I was listening to some of the analysis over the past few days, and Brian, it is interesting the degree to which people who have run campaigns point out how significant a lot of the seats where the auto sector is represented are to the Liberals, right? The number of swing seats, the number of seats up for grabs, the number, just purely like from a vote-based perspective versus, let's say, where the canola news was best received in Saskatchewan and to a lesser degree Manitoba, where the same opportunities don't exist. What do you make of that?
Yeah, first off, Tom, you can thank me later for ending the Taylor Swift reference chain going on, so I'm not going to make one. Look, Bash, I think you're absolutely right, and anybody that's accusing the Prime Minister of playing politics on these topics, I think, is not really paying attention. I mean, there's really, from a crass point of view, the word that you use, there's really no reason to do this in this way. Same thing with the MOU with Alberta. I mean, there's nobody that's going to make the argument is because they think they're going to gain a bunch of seats, or even if it's to retain seats in the West. I mean, the math just doesn't make sense from a political point of view. So I'm going to sound like a broken record. I always say this on this question. I mean, my sense is that either that doesn't really matter, and I think a lot of people would say, well, that's kind of cool. We've never really seen that before, so that could be good. But if it does matter, if they are really making political calculations with these moves, my guess is, again, this is the broken record, that they are saying to themselves, all that's going to matter at the end of the day is how the economy is doing. And for whatever reason, they think that these moves are the right thing for the Canadian economy. And they believe that whenever they go back to the polls, if they can demonstrate some real wins, some movement, some improvement when it comes to the economic standards of our country, they'll be better placed to win the election. So my guess is that it's simple as that. It's one of the two. It just doesn't really compute with this prime minister, or it really is the economy, the economy, the economy.
Even though from the second half of that framing, which both make a lot of sense to me, Tom, if you have an auto sector in total disrepair, like with people losing their job or companies moving to the United States, not to say that one move with China would have blunted that, but that would have to be a concern from an economic perspective as well.
It is, but you have to put the two together, because I'm a little bit different from Brian on this. I think it's a sea change to have Scott Moe going to China with Mark Carney. I think it's amazing that Danielle Smith and Mark Carney sat down and had a memorandum of understanding about a pipeline. I'm not naive. I don't think it switches a bunch of seats. But it's the first time in my political memory that you have the Western provinces looking towards Ottawa and seeing an ally. With regard to the auto sector, it's been hard hit by Donald Trump. Why did we put ourselves in lockstep with the Americans on this 100% tariff? Well, it was Trudeau and Biden, and the Americans had made the call, and we just went along with it. And that got us nothing in return except grief and tariffs from Trump. So for Carney to go to China and say we're going to open back up, this goes exactly to the play that Doug Ford said he wanted us to do. He ran that ad during the Baseball World Series. He ran that ad with the clip of Ronald Reagan. What was the essence of that clip? Let the market prevail. Let people buy stuff where it's cheaper. Don't tariff it, because otherwise it's consumers who pay that. Why should Canadian automobile consumers, somebody looking to buy an electric car to do the right thing environmentally, why shouldn't they have the right to buy a $35,000 or $40,000 Chinese electric vehicle that is of the same caliber and quality as a $70,000 Tesla? Why shouldn't they be allowed to do that? There was no proof of dumping. There was an affirmation of dumping, no objective analysis of it. We just went along with the Yanks. Well, it got us nothing in return. And I think that Carney's thinking about Canadian consumers in all of this because they're being hard hit by all the madness around King Trump. So I'm fine with this decision, and I do find it worthwhile to note that there is a sea change in the attitude between Ottawa and the Western provinces both ways. And I think that that'll play out very importantly into the next election.
Well, I would say they're certainly used to being the subject of this discussion way more over the last number of years. Like, why do they feel kind of put off than Ontario would be? Just a final question to you, Benzie, though. My guess is that it's the auto industry that certainly has the ear of the Premier, because to Tom's point, I understand everything he's laying out. But what we did, the case that was made at the time was that those cars are cheaper because of a heavily subsidized industry in China, which puts at a disadvantage the Canadian industry, which at the time we were all in on from the federal and provincial perspective with taxpayer dollars. That market is very different now, so I understand even an argument based on the change in the market. But my guess is the auto sector is, leaning heavily into the Premier at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, and they have his ear. Understandably, it's a very important sector here in Ontario, Vashi. It's the most important manufacturing sector, but the Prime Minister has to think of the whole country. I think, though, if I'm Mark Carney looking at an electoral map, Ontario is way more important than Saskatchewan. So those Saskatchewan 14 seats, maybe he picks up one more there. He has many dozens of seats that he could lose here in Ontario. Now, I asked Mr. Ford today if he was going to make this an issue during an election, which we could have one this year. He said he thought it would be, but he said, I'm not going to get involved. I think it would be very unlikely, Vashi, for Doug Ford to be campaigning against Mark Carney. Remember, the one person that Doug Ford really doesn't like is Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader. So I don't think there's too much of a risk of that happening.
They're making overtures. They're talking again. Benzie, come on. We'll see. Okay, I got to take a quick commercial break. We're back with the front bench on the other end of that break to talk about a different threat emanating from U.S. President Donald Trump. This one toward a NATO ally in Denmark, all about Greenland. We're talking about that next.
It's a serious situation, and we're concerned. We're concerned about this escalation. The future of Greenland, decisions about the future of Greenland are for Greenland and Denmark to decide.
Any decision about the future status of Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark alone.
It's not easy when we wake up every morning to new threats. Please convey that message to the President. And therefore, for a second, I thought, we have managed not to solve the problem, but to find a pathway forward. It was disrupted by the statement from the President.
Donald Trump wants control of Danish territory, Greenland, insisting only America can defend the Arctic nation, and launching a new tariff threat against European countries that have come out in Denmark's defense. For Canada, our government is in its own trade talks with the United States, and the President has previously mused about Canada's ability to defend our Arctic shores. So how should the federal government handle this one? Let's bring back our front bench, Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. The Prime Minister is going to be in Davos in the next few days. So is President Trump. Tom, what is Canada's move here?
So is the German Chancellor, who's decided to drop everything and head to Davos, and so is the Prime Minister of Norway, who today was one of the recipient of one of the most delirious missives from Donald Trump ever. In this one, he said, I'm no longer only about peace, and it's your fault because you didn't give me the Nobel Peace Prize, as if it was the government of Norway that was responsible for that. But be that as it may, we're into uncharted territory here. I know. We've been saying about Trump 4 years in his first term, and now we're starting the second year of his second term. But it really is uncharted. The dismembering of anything that was considered valid internationally, I don't think we come to grips with the reality of the United States president saying he's going to take a part of another NATO country and expect to get away with it. And any NATO country that goes in to try to stop that is going to be punished by the United States of America. I don't think we've actually wrapped our heads around that, but that's where we are, Vashi. So yes, everybody's meeting in Davos. Perhaps there will be a conversation. Trump tends to be able to work better one-on-one when he actually meets people. Maybe something will come of that. But you're right to point out the fact that our Arctic is singularly unprotected. And if that is the excuse for Trump trying to go after Greenland, then we better start paying attention. Because the 51st state stuff takes on a whole new meaning when you realize that Trump, if he's looking at Greenland that way, could say the same thing about Ellesmere Island, for example.
How are you, Lisa, wrapping your head around this one?
I'm actually growing more concerned, Vashi. I watched CNN on the weekend. They had Mike Pence on, and he was asked about Greenland, and he didn't dismiss it. He actually thought that the U.S. going after Greenland made sense. He didn't like the way it was happening, but he thought it was smart, and he claimed sovereignty as a result. That shook me. I have to say that this is not something that's just being batted around within a Trump administration. Other leaders are talking about it. And the more you normalize this kind of crap, the more likely it's going to come to a country near you. And I put this all against the fact that we're facing possibly 2 referendums this year on whether or not our own country wants to stay together. And does that allow for foreign interference in something as intrinsic as these votes? And are we sleepwalking into a Brexit? I am actually really concerned. And I don't know how you put the genie back in the bottle, because he wants legacy. And not many presidents can say that they actually added to their geographic expanse. They would become the number 2 sized country in the world after Russia. I just don't like where this is going.
What does it mean for, I mean, there's lots of competing things that Canada has to worry about, Brian, in this instance. Territorial integrity, the NATO alliance, our European allies, and then on the other side is our relationship with the United States, which is at this very precipitous moment when we are about to embark on a formal review process for the deal that is keeping our economy largely insulated from a deafening blow. Like, what is the way through that? Just 30 seconds, go for it. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the question. Look, I can only say, echoing Lisa and Tom's comments, I'm happy that they're musing about the idea of sending troops over to do the military exercise with our NATO allies. I mean, there has to be red lines, and for the reasons Lisa and Tom went through, I think there's definitely should be one. And look, I think on a one-on-one, I agree with Tom. I think it's actually good that they may all be in Davos. That might be helpful, as Trump might sit down with some of these people, and the conversation can't hurt. And look, they can also soften it a bit and say, well, look, if you really believe that there's a threat, then these military exercises are that much more important if you're worried about China and Russia going after Greenland. So there's a way to kind of also soften it a little bit, but I still think the message, the macro message is still clear that NATO allies aren't going to take it. And I think that's exactly one of the red lines that they should be drawing.
Yeah, it does feel like one of those moments where, to Brian's point, Benzie, the red line has to be drawn. Even in the way I listen to the various prime ministers, it's more emphatic than I've heard our own prime minister or the prime minister of the United Kingdom be on issues that involve Trump. More emphatic than they have been in a long time. Like there seems to be an attempt not to mince words.
Yeah, and I think they have to be clear. The problem with Trump is that he is so unpredictable and mercurial. But at the end of the day, sometimes it all just feels like it's just some reality TV show to him or some psychodrama, and he's looking for attention, and he's got attention. And frankly, Vashi, I blame the Mercator projection map that makes Greenland look bigger than it actually is. I think he looks at it and he thinks this is the country the size of Australia, and it's not. But, I mean, the U.S. has one base, as Peter MacKay was saying to you earlier on the show there. At one point, I think they had like 14 Army bases and 3 naval bases. So they've had a significant military presence on Greenland before, so they could again, I suppose, without taking the sovereignty of Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark. It's just so messy. And the one person who loves this, Vladimir Putin, he's looking at NATO possibly imploding over the most specious thing. The whole thing sounds like it's from an Evelyn Waugh novel or something. It's just so preposterous. But here we are.
Here we are, and I will leave it on that note. Somewhat depressing, but very realistic note. Thanks, guys. Appreciate the discussion as always. Our front bench: Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. We'll take a quick break. We've got more Power Play, pardon me, on the other end of that break.
The meeting we had last week left me with the clear impression that the president honestly and full-heartedly want to acquire Greenland. But we also made it crystal clear that this is a red line. I mean, having said that, we agree to disagree. It is not easy when we wake up every morning to new threats. Please convey that message to the president. And therefore, for a second, I thought, we have managed not to solve the problem, but to find a pathway forward. It was disrupted by the statement from the president, and that's a reality of life.
That's the Foreign Affairs Minister of Denmark talking there about our top story today, what's happening with Greenland and the more persistent threats from U.S. President Donald Trump that he wants to acquire Greenland. Today, he was asked by NBC News in a phone interview if that could involve the use of force, and his response was no comment. Now, that individual you just heard from, along with other officials, met with the White House, with other White House delegates last week in Washington. They had anticipated that perhaps the temperature could be turned down. And then a number of European and NATO allies ended up sending troops to Greenland as part of NATO exercises, but that were seen to be sort of there to send a signal. And that generated a new response from U.S. President Donald Trump, who then started threatening additional tariffs and said, in fact, over the weekend that he would apply 10% tariff to all of those European countries as of February. Canada, a senior federal government source, is also considering sending a very small number of troops to participate in those exercises as soon as later this week. We have heard no speculation yet from the president or people in the White House about what that would mean for Canada and the level of tariffs that are already applied to this country. I will say it should get interesting over the next few days. In Davos, Switzerland, Prime Minister Carney is there. He'll meet with French President Emmanuel Macron tomorrow. President Trump will be there later this week. There are a number of top trade officials from the White House who are there as well. So lots of developments to watch for out of Switzerland. I'm going to leave Power Play there. I'm Vashti Kapellas. Thanks so much for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your night.